Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening I'm joined by Lance Izumi. He's the Education Director at the Pacific Research Institute. He's an author, all-around good guy, I'm told. Lance, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's terrific to be on your show.
Well, thank you. And so, tell us a little bit about Lance the man. Who are you? How did you arrive at this point in life?
Well, I appreciate that. It's been basically a pretty long road. I started off life as a recovering lawyer, and
sorry to hear that.
I know, right? But then I went actually into my first job. Really, out of law school was not, in doing law, but I was a political speechwriter for a number of years. I was a speechwriter for Attorney General Ed Meese in President Reagan's administration, and then I was the chief speechwriter for Governor George Duke-Machen after that. And after writing speeches for the terrific people, I decided that I really wanted to kind of write under my own byline, which is why I went into the think tank business and worked for the Claremont Institute for a while, a conservative think tank down in Southern California, and then now have been with the Pacific Research Institute for, gosh, more than 20 years now.
Right. So how does one go from law school, which at least in California is not known for being very conservative as a whole, and then shaping words to shaping thought in a conservative mindset? I mean, that's almost like asking for trouble.
Well, when I was an undergraduate and while I was in law school, I did a fair amount of freelance writing, often for my college dailies. And so, to their credit, I had obviously a very conservative point of view, but they were very willing to, publish my pieces. So I wrote for the Daily Bruin, also wrote for the law school publication at USC, where I was, I was in law school. I was at UCLA as an undergraduate. And, I also wrote for different conservative publications on a freelance basis. And it was actually from there that, I made the jump after law school to start writing speeches for elected officials. Actually, my very first job out of law school was actually working for Mike Antonovich, who is a conservative Los Angeles County supervisor. And, I went from there, to work for Ed Meese in Washington and then Governor Duke-Machen in Sacramento.
So then from there you went into the think tank business, as you said. So which came first, the think tank business or the authorship direction?
Well, I've always been, everybody's got their talents, and I've always been a person who enjoyed writing, mm-hmm. and I always thought that the best job in the world would actually be to have a job where I could basically write about ideas, uh-huh. And I thought that that might be as a columnist or working for a think tank, and it turned out after cutting my teeth as a speechwriter, I was able to actually make that come true by going into the think tank business. Mm-hmm. And so right now at Pacific Research Institute, not only do I write studies, I write books, for the Institute, I also write op-ed pieces for them on education issues. And I was just recently named a opinion contributor to Education Week, which is the nation's top education publication.
A conservative writing for education publications that are not, wow, you do ask for trouble.
Well, yes, but what's a good thing is that publications like Education Week do want to have a diversity of opinion, and so I think that that's the important thing, is to be able to get one's ideas out there, sure. Even to people who may not be at first receptive to it, but hopefully the things that I write from a more conservative point of view make people think twice about their assumptions about subjects that they thought that they had a dyed-in-the-wool opinion.
Right, and I do want to tap on that some more because conservatives aren't known for compassion or caring, and for some reason the liberal mindset is the one that's supposed to be compassionate about education and everything else, where if you do look at how analytical many conservatives are, mm-hmm. you would see that education would make sense to them. They're just not necessarily always as vocal about it, but it's one of those topics that really brings us together. We all care about having right. kids that can function in the world and think for themselves theoretically, and so I want to tap on that more. But your most recent book is called The Corrupt Classroom.
That's right.
How many books have you written in the book form? Obviously, you're prolific and you've done lots of things with words, but a book specifically?
Well, I've written a number of books. You know, my first book was actually I wrote it back in 2005, around the time of Hurricane Katrina. Actually, it was a book on model charter schools in California. And, you know, I wrote about charter schools were, you know, a relatively recent phenomenon back then. And so I wrote about those that were performing very well in the state, and it was called Free to Learn, was the name of the book. And actually, I was very heartened by the fact that back then, a number of the folks who were trying to reestablish the school system back in New Orleans after the hurricane actually used my book, to help the process back there of getting the school system back on its feet.
Right.
And so I went back there and did some training for some school principals, at that time. And so that was a great impact to have in something that was obviously something terrible and serious, but hopefully now that New Orleans is had a bit of an education renaissance,
right.
Because of the fact that so many of the schools there now are charter schools,
right.
And so, so I thought that's a great start to my book writing career, and I've written books on blended education, blended learning, which is the melding of computer-assisted education with traditional classroom education. My book that just came out actually a couple years ago called Moonshots in Education was written, co-authored with somebody here in the Silicon Valley, Esther Wojcicki, who is a journalism teacher at Palo Alto High School. And so we co-authored this book together, and it's done quite well, looking at this phenomenon and this education revolution, really, of blended learning. And I think it's really the wave of the future.
Well, and it makes sense that it doesn't have to be an either or. You
Right.
still need humans
Yes.
adding their component, and you can use technology to enable them. But you've used a couple of rewords,
Yes.
that are intriguing to me as to how you define them. So when you talk about education renaissance or revolution, and to me it sounds like rebirth would be another reword that would be in there. How are you defining that transition? What was the old? What's the new?
Well, I think that,
trend?
one of the things that, for example, Sal Khan of the Khan Academy, which is very well known, throughout the world, really, and, certainly Sal had his start, bringing that concept here in the Silicon Valley area. He talks about how before we had this infusion of education technology in the classroom and all the possibilities that it brings, you had basically a Prussian-style teaching model or learning model where you had a whole classroom where all the kids are marching basically in lockstep, with the teacher basically calling all the shots. And what education technology does is that it kind of unleashes the ability of individuals to be able to go as fast and as rapidly as they are able to do so, not because the curriculum tells them that they need to be at a certain point, not because the teacher tells them they have to be here or there. It's really up to the individual, and the technology allows them to be able to basically reach their individual potential and not be tied to the assumptions of the whole class or far away district or state officials.
Right. So you're actually talking about a model where the education system can adapt to the child versus the kids who may or may not be able to adapt to the system.
That's exactly right. So it's really that personalized learning that we all really want for our children. And so the education software that's out there right now and that's being used in many schools, whether it's charter schools or in regular public schools or in private schools, that that software now is able to meet kids where they are and see where their trajectory is, how they can raise their performance, and so that they are able to blossom as a person and not, again, be forced to be part of a whole army of other kids.
Right. Well, I mean, my wife's a teacher and has been for 25 years in a Montessori system, which is all about follow the child and,
Yes.
and adapt to their needs. And what's interesting about this model is there may be kids who have a very strong aptitude toward mathematics, as an example, others with English or whatever. But what you're talking about is a model where they can actually play to their strengths, but not be so beaten down by some of the things that maybe are areas for improvement, to use a politically correct type of a statement. So that this could actually help with things like self-esteem or other things, so that they could see something that they actually perform in versus being bogged down with the failure points, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I did another book called Short Circuited, which looked at the online learning revolution here in California, and I did also a video based upon that book. And one of the things I did was I looked at the examples of individual students who are able to make use of this online learning revolution. And one of the kids that I profiled was a boy who had autism, and his needs were not being met in his traditional public school, and he was therefore homeschooled by his parents, but using these new education software through an online model, and he was able to really blossom as a learner. And so, whereas he had been failing or doing very badly, in the traditional public school setting, when he was able to use the technology, the software that met him at where he was, and be able to raise him up from there, he was able to really prosper and do extremely well in his studies.
Right. And so you've talked about several things. You're talking about technology, you're talking about homeschooling options, charter school options, and a lot of these, at least within the California context, tend to raise temper levels amongst certain crowds, but you're making it sound like these things could work for the right student.
Yeah, and
are you an advocate of choice or something like that?
Well, certainly I am an advocate of choice, but the thing of it is that this is choice for all kids. Not just kids who with conservative parents, or kids who have parents who believe in certain religious philosophies or whatever. These whoever you are as a child and whoever your parents are, you should have the ability to go to the school or the type of learning situation that best meets your individual needs.
Right.
And so no one has a claim on you as an individual to say that you've got to do it just this one way, and that there should be no options for you.
Right.
And so that's why I think that when you look at countries, for example, like Sweden, which have a universal school choice system where kids can go to whichever school, public or private, that they want to. What's interesting is that the entire country, whether they're from the left or from the right, parents support those choices because they want to have the best schooling for their kids, and it's not a matter of political ideology.
Right. And so with whole other countries doing this type of thing and having choice and still being held up as being successful, these are things that can still be managed even if there's a less of a perceived control from unions or bureaucrats or whatever. All of these things can be put through a system so that you are somewhat monitoring the outcomes, correct?
Yes, and so, I mean, you look, again, you look at countries such as Sweden and other places that have these choice models that they're using. Part of the way that there's accountability is simply the competition between the various systems.
Now you're using words like competition in education.
That's exactly right. Yeah, but what's interesting is that when I wrote a book called Not As Good As You Think, which looked at the underperformance of middle-class kids here in California, and I did a video based upon that book, where I actually went to Sweden and I interviewed the governor of Stockholm at the time, who was the former Minister of Education in Sweden, where this universal choice program had come in. And one of the things that he told me in that interview was that he was surprised to learn that once they introduced this competition through this choice system, that the headmasters of the public schools came to him and said that, well, if those guys in the private sector are doing this or that, then we can do it and better. so that it forced them to look at the situation in a different way, and also incentivize them to raise their performance.
And so it's not just the kids that need to raise their performance, it's the administration and the staff inside the schools too? Again, more crazy talk.
Yeah, more crazy talk, but common sense talk. Because I think that, again, this is something that, we think in a place like Sweden, which, is viewed in many ways as a socialistic country, but yet, when it came to education, you ended up having a much more market-oriented system. Yeah. And so I think that, the lesson there is that a rising tide lifts all boats. Right. And whether it's the kids who decide to go into the private system or kids who remained in the public system, that the performance rose amongst all. Well,
and it's also interesting that even within socialistic types of societies, competition can be an improvement point.
Yes.
That's interesting. So let's talk about the most recent book, The Corrupt Classroom. What are the top 3 things in that book that you would just hope people would recognize and possibly strive to make changes toward?
Well, I think that the reason why I wrote the book, The Corrupt Classroom, in the first place was that we've been talking about choice, and I've talked a little bit about the academic performance of students in various settings, but that's not the only reason why parents want to make a choice about which school or learning situation they want their kids to be in. It could be a lot of non-academic reasons. For example, it could be that your son or daughter's classroom is very politicized, and you feel that they're not being taught, they're being indoctrinated. Right. Or else, it could be that your son or daughter may feel that they're unsafe in that school setting.
That makes it hard to study if you feel like you're going to be killed at any moment.
Well, exactly right.
Or at least beaten.
Lots of bad things, follow from the feeling of being unsafe. Not just that you could actually be physically harmed, but you could have depression. You could feel this sense of loneliness. You could have anxiety. All of these sorts of things that will impact your performance academically. Right. Is because of how you feel about your environment, about your safety within that school. And also, too, you could have issues involving the fiscal management or mismanagement of schools and school districts. And that has an impact on the classroom. You may not have resources. You may not have, certain activities. You may not have the best teachers, all of which because, officials have made the wrong fiscal decisions at a higher level. Right. And so, and on all of those things don't seem at first to involve academics, but they impact academics, and they're also reasons why parents may decide that, hey, I don't like what's going on in my school, and I would really love to have a different situation for my child.
Right. So if we could just spend a moment or two on each of those 3 subjects and give me examples. Anyone can say a classroom is politicized or unsafe or fiscally mismanaged, but are there a couple of high points for each of them that just really stand out into your mind? If people hadn't thought about it on that level, that if they smell this could be the problem?
Well, I think that, you just have to, look, for example, let's say the politicization of the classroom. Sure. And there's always been, because we're human, the institutions have these education systems, and you're going to have some of that leak in. But it just seemed, for example, that during the 2016 election, that everything went off the rails when it came to the politicization of the classroom. And my book, The Corrupt Classroom, documents, across the country where teachers were doing just outlandish things. For example, you had a teacher in Colorado who put a picture of President Trump, or Donald Trump at that time, his picture on a piñata, and basically had students take a whack at the piñata as part of a classroom activity. A parent there, in Colorado said, why is this happening in a school setting? Right. Why try and divide people when, schools are supposed to bring people together? Right. And, you had a parent in North Carolina, for example, who were complaining that their English teacher at the local high school was comparing Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler, and making incredibly disparaging remarks about the president there. And unfortunately for those parents, and I have some quotes from them in the book, they felt constrained from letting, people know that they felt that this was impacting their child and impacting them as parents, because they felt that the school system beat down anybody who disagreed with kind of the prevailing ideology within the district. And so, so parents, whether in whichever part of the country and whichever party or whichever candidate they support, they shouldn't feel that way.
Right.
And if they do feel that way, they should have options for their child.
Sure.
And,
okay, and so then from a safety perspective, what kinds of things were you seeing as you were writing the book?
Well, there are individual examples just all across America. I mean, for example, one of the examples I mentioned is a little 9-year-old girl in Alabama who was beaten up very badly at her school, and that's bad enough. But when when her mom came to the school to pick her up, the school nurse there lied to the mom and said that the child had not been beaten up but had accidentally fallen.
Repeatedly?
Repeatedly.
Yeah,
well,
that happens.
Even though this child was suffering from a concussion and was bleeding profusely at the time, she managed to pipe up and thankfully say to her mom, "No, Mom, I told them that this other girl jumped me."
Right.
And so, of course, the mother was shocked at this and then went to the principal and asked the principal what was going to be done about the perpetrator. And the principal assured her that the perpetrator would be suspended. And what it turned out was never suspended. And so, therefore, that's the kind of thing where, and so it's unsurprising that the parent then took the child out of the school and is now homeschooling her.
Right.
And so, that kind of thing is just, one example out of thousands and thousands across America, where you have 65% of America's public schools reporting one or more incidents of violence, happening at their campuses. And in middle schools, you have 88% of the middle schools in this country reporting one or more incidents of violence, all of which translates to about 750,000 crimes, in school campuses. And so that's really a shocking statistic.
Sure. And so mismanagement, I mean, what's the biggest mismanagement aspect that you're seeing from a fiscal
Well, I think that, when you look at, for example, here in California, where places like Los Angeles Unified School District, where, they are now facing a, more than $400 million deficit in in 2019, I believe. And it's because of voluntary actions by the school board in terms of negotiating various contracts, giving out various benefits to special interest groups within the school district. Even though they, in Los Angeles, for example, have been warned about these practices by their own appointed officials, I think that it's pretty shocking that, and what it tells you is that what's more important to some of these school boards are the special interests within those districts, as opposed to the children for whom the education is and the learning system is supposed to exist in the first place.
Right. And so we've only got about a minute left, and I would love to hear about solutions. I'm sure others would as well, but it sounds like they're going to have to look you up elsewhere to make that happen and to figure out. I'm sure you have solutions as far as...
Absolutely. Both in my book, The Corrupt Classroom, and in my other publications, again, we've been talking about school choice, and, really what we need in California and across the country are systems which allow parents to be able to choose their school and not be locked in to just one public school in their zip code.
Okay.
You need to have, whether it's through an education savings account, a tax credit, or some other mechanism that gives a parent an immediate exit ticket for their child if they're in a situation that they don't want to be in.
Okay. Well, if you'll hold on for just a moment, we've appreciated all of your knowledge. We'll be back after a word from our underwriters, The Conservative, and now called the Liberty Forum.
Some people think that a meeting of conservatives in Silicon Valley could fit in a small room. In fact, when the Conservative Forum was founded in 2003, we did meet in a small room, a coffee shop in San Jose. It doesn't get more grassroots than this. It may surprise you that there are thousands of people right here in Silicon Valley who share your principles of liberty, free markets, and limited government. Since our humble beginnings in that coffee shop, we've outgrown 3 meeting halls. From San Jose to Gilroy to Mill Valley, we bring hundreds of people together each month from all over the Bay Area to promote the principles of American liberty. How do we do it? It starts with a stellar lineup of speakers. Speakers like Steve Forbes, Senator Jim DeMint, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, Andrew Breitbart, Pamela Geller, and many others. These speakers passionately articulate our shared principles and remind us why conservatism isn't just the smart choice, it's also the moral choice. Our monthly meetings are only one dimension of the forum. We underwrite The Right Side, a monthly television show on cable access channel KMVT. We also host a monthly Constitution discussion group and provide tables at our meetings for more than a dozen local groups who share our love of liberty to promote their specific cause. The Conservative Forum is the premier place in Silicon Valley for conservatives to gather, become invigorated, motivated, and empowered. We welcome guests to our monthly meetings and offer special discounted pricing to first-time visitors. Take a look at our speaker lineup in the coming months and join us to learn why we say liberty is made in America.
And that was a word from our underwriters, the Liberty Forum. Now, what they're best known for is not the show, even though they're underwriting us now for the 7th season, but it's their speaker series, which is why we have Lance with us in the studio this evening. After he leaves here, he'll be rushed across to the other side of town, and we'll be presenting there at the IFES Portuguese Hall at 432 Sterling Road here in Mountain View. But in February, Dr. Gary Wolfram, who's a professor of economics and public policy at Hillsdale College, will be there. And in March, I'm sure it's going to be a packed house for Ann Coulter, columnist and author. There's also a special presentation that'll be happening at the end of January where Michael Medved will be speaking. You can find out more information about that at theconservativeforum.com or soon at the new Liberty Forum website. In closing, normally at this point, you would be getting a kiss goodbye from me and we'd be going, but we ran a little short. So, Lance, I just wanted to ask you, if somebody wants more information and more of your solutions, obviously they can find your work at Pacific Research Institute or by Googling you. Is there a website you'd like them to go to?
Absolutely. They should go to www.pacificresearch, all one word, pacificresearch.org.
Okay, excellent. And so we do encourage you to go back and look Lance up. If there's more information or if you'd like a way to just throw firing darts at him, then go ahead and do that. But in the interim, we've enjoyed having you on the show and having a chance to share Lance with you this evening. If you have questions or comments, you can reach out to us at therightsidetv@gmail.com, or you can maybe run into us in person or on the show sometime soon. Thanks for joining us. I've been your host, Chris Pareja. This has been The Right Side, and we will see you again soon. Have a great night.